Hey everyone, and welcome back. Have you been putting a lot of miles or kilometers onto your e-bike? Or have you been riding in rain or other inclement weather a lot lately? If so, it might be time to replace your brake pads. Now in this video, I'm going to cover how to check your pads for wear, how to replace your brake pads, and then finally how to make slight adjustments to the brake calipers and rotors for that perfect alignment. Let's check it out. So before we get started, here are the tools you need for this video. A pair of rubber gloves, multi-tool, torque wrench, plastic tire lever or piston spreader, a rotor truing fork, a metric tape measure or 3 business cards, a shop towel, some isopropyl alcohol, and brake pads for the Mosh City or Rush City. Now that we have our tools laid out, I want to emphasize that brake rotors can be hot after use and sharp when they're moving. Make sure to let your brake system cool completely before replacing your brake pads, and keep your fingers away from a moving rotor. Additionally, this method will be the same for both the Rush City and Mosh City models, even though the pads are different in each model. Now let's get to checking brake pad wear and replacing your brake pads. First, take off the wheel that requires the pad replacement using the multi-tool. Use a 6mm hex wrench for all through axles or a 5mm hex wrench for the Rush City rear wheel. Make sure to check out our wheel removal and install video for a more detailed explanation of this process. With the tire off, put on your gloves. It is important to always use gloves when touching brake pads to avoid contamination. Next, use a 3mm hex wrench to take out the pad retaining pin by threading it out counterclockwise. With the pin out, push out the old pads and spring. Now that you have the pads out, you can check your pad wear. The part to measure is the pad material, not including the colored backing plate. We recommend if your pad is worn down to 1mm thickness or less, it's time for replacements. Additionally, if you don't have a metric tape measure, 3 business cards is equivalent to 1mm, which is an easy way to check your pad thickness. Next, push the pistons in with the plastic tire lever or piston spreader until they are flush with the caliper body to allow the new brake pads to fit in. Fit the new pads into the spring and slide the group back into the caliper. Thread and tighten the pad retaining pin through the top of the pads and spring. Make sure to clean the brake rotor with isopropyl alcohol and a shop towel to avoid contamination. Finally, reinstall the wheel, taking care to align the rotors with the pads and tighten each through axle to 11 Nm or 15 Nm for the Rush City rear axle bolts. So sometimes after replacing your brake pads or after a really long ride with lots of braking, your brake rotors can be slightly scraping against your brake pads. Now don't worry, I'm going to show you how to fix this. And I'll first just cover a basic adjustment method, and then I'll lead into some more fine-tuning adjustments. Let's check it out. When adjusting a brake caliper, the first step is to loosen the 2 caliper bolts until the caliper can move side to side. Next, squeeze the corresponding brake lever to press the pads onto the rotor. Right lever for the rear, left lever for the front. While squeezing the lever, tighten down both caliper bolts. Once both bolts are tight, release the lever and spin the wheel to test if the rotor is still rubbing on the pads. If not, you are good to go. If the rotor is still rubbing, there are usually one of 2 problems. Problem number 1 being the rotors and pads are constantly in contact, and problem number 2 being the rotors will scrape or rub at a single point in an oscillating fashion. Now if the rotor is constantly rubbing on the pads, look down the thin vertical profile of the brake pads and rotor. Is the rotor shifted more towards one side or the other? If it is, you can do a slight adjustment by loosening 1 caliper bolt at a time to straighten the pads to line up with the rotor. Once this process is done, the rotor will no longer rub. If the rotor is still scraping at one point or in an oscillating fashion, your rotor might be slightly bent. Spin the wheel while looking at the thin vertical profile of the brake pads and rotor. Can you see and hear when the rotor is touching one side of the pads? If so, this is the part of the rotor that needs to be bent slightly back to make the rotor straight. Use a rotor truing tool to bend the rotor back very slightly to straight. Make sure to use very small movements and spin the wheel after each slight bend to check your progress until there is no sound coming from the pads or rotors. Again, clean the brake rotors with isopropyl alcohol to avoid contamination and replace your wheel. So that's all I have for this video, guys, but I hope you're now more confident when checking your brake pad wear, replacing your brake pads, or making slight adjustments to the brake rotor and caliper. Now, the next step is to go check out our video, which is called Bedding in Your Pads. It's going to walk you through the bed-in process very thoroughly, and you want to do this before you take your bike out riding. But after you watch that video, make sure you get out and take a long ride and have fun.